Before we get started, here are some concepts you should know in order to fully grasp the meaning of what we'll be saying in the next few minutes.
The Treaty of Lisbon is an international agreement that unites the two treaties that form the constitutional basis of the European Union.
Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon gives any EU member state the right to live independently and outlines procedure for doing so. It gives the living country 2 years to negotiate an exit deal.
The House of Commons is the lower house of the UK Parliament. It's an elected body consisting of 650 members known as Members of Parliament.
And lastly, the referendum.
The referendum is a vote in which all the people in a country are asked to decide an important political question. In this case, if they want to leave or remain in the European Union. Moving on, Brexit, as some of you may already know, is the abbreviation of British exit. It refers to the referendum written in June 23rd in 2016 by the United Kingdom, reporting that they want to leave the European Union.
This referendum first existed due to David Cameron, who served as Prime Minister at the time, and who, in hopes of pleasing everyone, the people who wanted to leave the EU and those who wanted to stay, chose to put this question to a vote, never in a million years thinking this would be the outcome. The day after the results came out, he resigned from his post, being replaced by Theresa May, who, after 3 failed attempts to get the deal she negotiated with the EU accepted by the House of Commons, also resigned from the post, leaving the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to step up.
Some of you might be confused as to why the United Kingdom chose to leave the EU, and the rest of you might be confused the other way around. Therefore, we'll explain to you both sides of people's opinion.
Obviously, there are a number of reasons why people voted leave, and we can't be sure that any of these following reasons were thought of by everyone. We can, however, list a lot of great, reasonable, and statistically proven reasons that were definitely behind the thought process on the majority of the leave voters.
The working class feels threatened by people coming from other countries. This is due to the fact that foreign workers offer the exact same labor but for much lower prices, causing an increase of the unemployment of the British people.
Unfortunately, there's still a large number of people who feel inherently uncomfortable when it comes to social changes made in Britain in recent decades, especially when it comes to immigration. Polls showed that the majority of Leave voters feel much more hostile to terms such as multiculturalism, social liberalism, feminism, and environmentalism. People who voted for this reason and this reason only symbolize a mass longing to turn the cultural clock back.
That being said, immigration is a tricky area where things get especially hard to unravel, since we can never be sure that when people complain about immigration, they're complaining because of things such as racism, xenophobia, or general favoritism toward their country or nation, or if it is linked to economical factors, such as housing, low wages, the unfair distribution of national economic resources, or the pressure put on the National Health Service.
There's also been some false campaigning on behalf of the Leave Party, who claims that leaving the EU will free up £350 million a week extra to spend in the National Health Service. This type of statement is very appealing to any age group who's already able to vote. It comes as no surprise then when said party chose to splash this claim all over its campaign buses. Even more surprising is the fact that although this statement was described as misleading by the UK Statistics Authority, its power didn't reduce.
The Leave Party produced a very smart campaign, directing its focus on lower-income voters, as previously mentioned. It claimed that the UK cannot control the number of people entering the country while remaining in the EU, something that really hit home for those who feel threatened for whatever reason that may be by newcomers. Another false claim made by them that served as a key weapon was that the UK cannot stop Turkey from entering the EU. However, all of these claims managed to resonate with the British people and managed to convince them that this was a once-in-a-generation opportunity to take control, independence, and national supremacy.
As contrast to this, David Cameron, who supported the Remain campaign, didn't manage to do such well-thought-out campaigning as its opponent. Thinking that he had all the love and support from the British people and that he didn't need to put that much effort in his campaign clearly backfired, resulting in his resignation as Prime Minister.
Good morning, everyone. He announced this morning he will step down.
David Cameron, soon to be the former Prime Minister.
David Cameron has now announced his resignation.
David Cameron has announced he's quitting his seat in Parliament.
British Prime Minister David Cameron has announced his resignation.
It's a proven fact that the older you are, the more likely you are to make the effort to vote. 78% of those who are 65 or older voted in the 2015 election, whereas only 43% of 18 to 24-year-olds and 54% of 25 to 34-year-olds took the time to vote. When factoring this and research that shows that the support for Brexit was much higher among the older age group, the voting results should come as no surprise.
What appears clear from the campaign is that the vote to leave was as much a statement about the country's national identity and all that it involves as it was about its economic and political future.
Once again, there are countless reasons as to why people might have chosen remain instead of leave. However, we've come up with a good list that gives a somewhat general, maybe even a bit detailed view of why people voted this way.
The UK now accounts for less than 1% of the world's population and less than 3% of global income. Each year that goes by, these numbers shrink a little. The United Kingdom will find it very hard to get their voice heard on topics that affect their prosperity and well-being if they go at it alone.
The single market gives British business access to the entire EU with its 500 million consumers. Free trade is one of the most powerful ways of boosting wealth. It would be foolish of them to compromise their access to this market.
Their membership with the EU isn't as expensive as they believe it to be. In fact, their annual budget contribution, after taking account of money transferred back to the UK, is around £8.3 billion, which translates to 0.5% of their GDP, in other words, £130 per person.
When negotiating with America, China, and Japan, they are doing so as one of the world's largest trade bloc, which accounts for nearly 20% of the world's GDP. The balance of power would be extremely different if the UK stood on its own, considering that the US economy is 7 times as big as theirs, the Chinese is 5 times bigger, and the Japanese is twice the size. If they left the EU, they would often find themselves opening up their markets to the world's biggest economies instead of the other way around. They would have to negotiate with the EU, whose economy is 6 times as big as theirs, instead of treating it as a partnership.
Regarding immigration, instead of viewing it as a negative thing, why not think of all the good it brings? Newcomers are a rich source of culture that plugs into Britain's veins, adding more than they take out and propping up UK's public services.
According to South Bank University, around 2.5 million people are employed in the UK as a direct result of the EU trade, and another million indirectly because of that relationship. That's 1 in 10 people who work in Britain. If they lost 1% of those jobs, that would mean 30,000 people out of work. The Remain campaign has even estimated that unemployment could rise by 820,000 people.
Never has Central and Western Europe registered such long free war period. The EU is the most successful peace project ever, having been distinguished with the Nobel Peace Prize.
Equal pay for men and women is enshrined in EU law. That's progressive EU legislation, as are the bans on discrimination over age, race, and sexual orientation. EU workers have a number of not only perks, but basic human rights, and British people have these benefits too, but Employment Minister Priti Patel, a strong Brexit advocate, has called them a burden, and even current Prime Minister Boris Johnson has referred to these types of problems as all that social chapter stuff.
Choosing to leave the EU would take a huge toll on family vacations. Family vacations are an important economic and social factor for everyone involved. According to David Cameron, the average family holiday could be £230 more expensive if they leave the EU, while Ryanair's boss said, "Airfares and the cost of holidays will rise. That's not speculation, that's a fact." We don't mean to assume, but I think it's safe to say that if the UK does indeed leave the EU, they won't be having as many happy tourist families as they did before all this.
Lastly, as we've seen, it suits both sides to have the UK residents strongly believing that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, or if that they don't choose to exit now, they may never leave again. And granted, there can be a referendum every few months, but that doesn't mean that they can never have one again in the future.
The world is changing, and the EU is changing with it. Voting Remain is a pragmatic choice. It's safe, sensible, and secure. And if they don't feel good about the course of the EU in 5, 10, or 15 years, there's no reason to not have this debate again.
The island of Ireland is composed by Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. However, only Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, which begs the question, how was Ireland involved in all of this?
At the moment, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland are two independent states and both belonging to the EU. They have a bilateral agreement that allows free travel between them. If the UK leaves the EU, the rules would have to change. An external EU border would have to be put up between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which would have to be secured. After all, the EU has strict rules in which products are exported and imported and under which conditions.
The problem is no one wants a hard border between these two Irelands. But how can Brexit take place while preventing a hard inner Irish border at the same time? A comprehensive customs and trade deal between the EU and the UK would be one solution, but this is yet to be agreed. That's why the EU has proposed the so-called backstop, a kind of insurance that, if needed, guarantees there will be no hard border between the island of Ireland.
The backstop stipulates that the whole UK would remain in a customs union with the EU following Brexit until a better solution is found, which basically means that trade would remain as is for the time being, but with one key difference. The UK would have to abide by EU regulations and would have no say in the rules. After all, the country would no longer be a EU member. So, it's no wonder that the backstop is so controversial. Prime Minister Boris Johnson sees it as unacceptable, but he has yet to propose an alternative that all sides could deal with.
The backstop is going to be removed, I very much hope. And that is, I insist, because that's the only way to get a deal. The UK Parliament will not accept the current withdrawal agreement. There's no way that is going through. But the crucial thing to understand is that we will not accept, and I've seen a bit of chatter about this, a bit of stuff in the media about this, we will not accept either a Northern Ireland only backstop. That simply doesn't work for the UK. We've got to come out whole and entire and solve the problems of the Northern Irish border, and I'm absolutely certain that we can do that. But we're working very...
As we mentioned early on, Theresa May's deals have been rejected 3 times. She survived the no-confidence vote held on January 16, and she unveiled her Plan B on January 21st, which was later criticized for being very similar to her original deal. MPs voted against her deal by 391 to 242 votes on March 12, despite May's claim of legally binding changes to the agreement, setting Britain on the path to a no-deal Brexit. Parliament stepped in to delay it, and the EU gave its permission. May's deal was rejected again on March 29 by a margin of 58 votes, despite her vow to resign before the next stage of negotiations if it was passed.
You've probably understood by now that the best possible outcome during this whole Brexit extravaganza is for the UK to leave with a deal, which would provide both sides with an agreement in place about what the relationship between the UK and the EU will be like in the future. This is why a lot of people working in Parliament are trying to avoid a no-deal Brexit, which would mean the UK leaving the EU immediately with no agreement about the separation process.
Some border checks could be reintroduced. Transport and trade between the EU and the UK could be severely affected. Some drivers might need a special driving license to drive in the EU. It could cost them more money to use their phone in EU countries. It would mean no transition period, which was part of the deal proposed by Theresa May, which was rejected by MPs.
Boris Johnson has claimed that he would like to have a deal, but that he's willing to exit without one on 31st of October if a suitable one cannot be agreed upon. However, in September, MPs passed a law that would force the Prime Minister to ask the EU for an extension to the 31st of October deadline if a deal had not been reached by 19th of October. This is called the Ben Act. This is clearly something that Johnson has no desire to do, having said that I'd rather be dead in a ditch than ask for an extension.
Johnson ended up sending 3 letters to the EU. The first letter was the one requesting the extension, one that he didn't actually sign for. The second was a letter saying that an extension would be a bad idea and deeply corrosive. The third was a cover letter that came from the UK's ambassador to the EU. Some legal experts say that by sending the second letter, the Prime Minister is subverting the intention of law, which says that he has to request an extension, and while he's technically done that by sending the second letter, he's gone against the spirit of law by saying he doesn't actually want the extension.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government's priority is to secure the best possible deal as the country leaves the European Union. My ministers are committed to working with Parliament, the devolved administrations, business and others to build the widest possible consensus on the country's future outside the European Union. A bill will be introduced to repeal the European Communities Act and provide certainty for individuals and businesses.
It's important to stress that no country has ever left the EU since its creation in 1957, although some have tried. And we have no idea how something like this could impact the country leaving the EU and every other country in the world.